Hello, everyone. We're going to get started here. Welcome to CDW's Security at Home webinar. My name is Philip Flowwater, and I am an account executive on the enterprise sales team with CDW Canada. As a reminder, it is Wednesday, also known as Season 3, Episode 3 of Work from Home. Also a reminder that Friday is Good Friday. So we'll start off by taking a quick look at our agenda. Today's agenda includes, we'll do a quick introduction of the team, providing support to employees, top 3 risks, social engineering email phishing, social engineering phone-based phishing, weak passwords, outdated systems, and then additional considerations. We will have a Q&A portion. We will have this at the very end of the webinar. From this point, I will hand it over to Chris and Courtney to take it from there. And if you two could introduce yourselves and let the webinar know what you guys do and how you do it. Thanks.
Thanks, Phil. So I'll start off with myself. My name is Courtney Larmond. I'm a senior analyst in CDW's cyber risk department. I've been with CDW for a year and a half now, and I work with clients to conduct security assessments of their programs. So usually based on industry standards like ISO 27001 or NIST cybersecurity framework. And we do gap assessments, risk assessments, internal audits, and then I've also worked on implementations of security programs, usually based on ISO 27001 to help clients get certified in the standard.
And hi, everyone. I'm Chris Graziano, the team lead for cybersecurity. So I've been with CDW for about 2.5 years now, and my team and I both all conduct penetration testing and vulnerability assessments for clients, as well as red team engagements and social engineering engagements in order to assess organizations' security posture from a vulnerability perspective and to recommend remediations on how to close those gaps from a technical perspective. So we're going to start this presentation off here. Courtney will begin. And yeah, Courtney, go ahead.
Chris. Okay, so we'll start with providing support to employees. So when it comes to a security program and working from home, you want to try to limit the number of risks you're asking your employees to address. Some of your employees may not be overly technical, so it's important to be realistic about what you're asking them to do. And just ask them to address the main concerns and provide them with support for them to be able to do so. Second thing you want to do is implement a channel to answer questions or report any security incidents, preferably in real time. To do this, you can use an instant messaging platform that you have in your corporate environment, such as if you're using Slack or Teams. Or it could just be a dedicated email account. It's best to have a dedicated person to monitor this if possible. I know that not every organization is going to have someone that can be dedicated full-time to monitor these channels. So even if you just have somebody checking it throughout the day to make sure nothing critical is missed. So yeah, important to have a channel just to be able to answer any questions that employees have, whether it's working from home or any security incidents that they need help with addressing or any concerns that they have, and just providing that avenue for them to be able to get support within your organization. And lastly, it's important that you just provide them with any additional equipment that they may need. A lot of organizations, they don't have employees working from home all the time regularly, so they might not have all the equipment. So it's important just to reach out, ask them if there's anything additional you can do to support them, even if it's just mice, keyboards, monitors, anything that they need to do their job effectively can really help. we're going to move on to address the top 3 risks that organizations see with employees working remotely. The top risk is social engineering. The second one we're going to talk about is weak passwords. And then lastly is going to be outdated systems. So I'll just pass it off to Chris now to talk a little bit more in depth about these issues.
Thanks, Courtney. So when we're talking social engineering, we're talking about threat actors who are targeting either individuals or the organization through means of exploiting the human element behind the technology, essentially. So you're all probably familiar with email phishing attempts. There's also phone-based phishing attempts and even physical in-person phishing attempts that can occur. So from a work-from-home perspective, we're really looking at 2 major concerns when it comes to ensuring that the organization remains secure. And that's going to be your email phishing and your your phone-based phishing, also referred to as vishing. We'll touch on that in a second. But for email phishing, typically you're going to see 3 different types of email campaigns that could be sent to individuals in an organization. The first type of campaign is really going to be a malicious URL, where it's going to try and coax an individual to click on the URL, which would then lead them to a malicious page, typically, where it could potentially do a browser exploit and potentially allow information to be retrieved, or even doing remote code execution on the victim's machine. The second type of campaign that we would typically see would be a campaign that's geared towards harvesting credentials. And so what a attacker would typically do is send an email posing as a service that, let's say, has expired, or maybe it has a link in the email that forwards them to a fictitious page or a cloned page of, let's say, Microsoft Office 365 or another authentication portal that individuals may be using in the organization. And that fictitious page, once individuals enter credentials in there, it's captured by the attacker, and then they could use those credentials to target the organization further. Either that's through a VPN or through cloud-based services or any web servers that are hosted by the organization. And finally, the last type of social engineering campaign from an email phishing perspective would be some sort of malicious attachment. There are multiple malicious attachments that can potentially go through. And even if you have a lot of security controls in place, there are still novel methodologies out that can bypass many of the security filtering programs out there, and could potentially land on an individual's mailbox. And if they open those attachments, obviously that could lead to compromise of the individual's system. So with regards to email phishing, there's typically a few things to be looking out for. And this is what we should be educating our employees about. And so the things we're going to be looking for is unknown or suspicious senders. Taking a look at the from header in the email address and ensuring that it's from someone that is trusted is always an important thing to do when receiving email that could potentially be suspicious or have some sort of urgency related to it. And that brings me to the next point here, which is urgent requests or unexpected email attachments. So urgent requests typically try and scare an individual to doing some sort of action without thinking about it. And so if there is some request to, let's say, reset a password, or we need you to download this file in order to patch your system immediately, please click on this link. These are all red flags that should be resonating with the employees, and they should then at that point be either validating the from sender and then potentially even escalating this to a security team. And finally, the last thing to look out for, and while this may not necessarily be too common in a spear phishing attack, is spelling mistakes in email content. Usually wide campaigns that are meant to target multiple organizations, they may have spelling mistakes or major grammatical errors, which are clear indications of a potential phishing campaign. So recommendations for employees on what to do typically, do not click on any links or open any attachments that seem suspicious by any means. If you're not sure who the sender is, the best thing to do is to just ignore it and potentially even send it off to IT support, which is the second point. Forward any suspect emails to IT support. IT support is going to be able to validate whether or not that is a legitimate email or if it is potentially malicious. And finally, contacting the sender who sent you an email directly to ensure that the email originated from them. There are many types of phishing attacks that could potentially spoof legitimate addresses. So if something looks suspicious based on the activity, maybe this isn't a normal activity for that person to be requesting, that's something to be concerned about. And you should definitely contact the sender to find out, and contact them through another means, not necessarily through email, to find out if that email was in fact delivered from them. So that's typically what we would recommend for email phishing campaigns. And Courtney, you can go to the next slide. Oops, one too many. So let's talk about phone-based phishing. So phone-based phishing is a little more difficult to, I guess, pinpoint whether or not it's necessarily malicious or not right off the bat. And typically, we're going to be seeing phone-based phishing attacks where malicious actors are calling either IT support themselves or calling individuals posing as IT support. This is a typical type of campaign that threat actors will utilize to try and either get access to a system, get more information from an individual, or potentially even capture credentials. So what to look out for, again, malicious actors posing as IT support and requesting password resets. Another, I guess, thing to look out for is someone claiming to be Microsoft or someone claiming to be from Purelator or any sort of shipping, and having some sort of urgency to the request where they need you to perform some sort of action whereby you're divulging information or potentially even resetting credentials or downloading some sort of malicious file. Again, impersonators calling can also attempt to solicit confidential information. So it may not be necessarily related to a technology aspect, but they may be trying to get more information out of the individual about the organization itself, such as who individuals report to, who they should be trying to talk about potentially doing some sort of wire transfer. These are all things to be cognizant of. And especially in the current times, we do need to be especially cognizant of anything related to work at home policies or anything related to the COVID-19 pandemic, as threat actors are actively using these in both email campaigns as well as phone-based phishing campaigns to try and exploit individuals as well as organizations. So recommendations for phone-based phishing. Phone-based phishing can still appear to come from a legitimate phone number. However, if you don't recognize the number, best thing is to not necessarily answer it. Now, obviously, this is, we all are conducting business, and if it is important, most individuals will leave a message. But if it is someone calling from, let's say, IT support, that number could potentially be spoofed as well, as that is something that can be done in today's technology. So if someone calls directly, the best thing to do would have the individual who's receiving the call tell the person on the phone that they're going to hang up and call support back. And at that point, the employee should be calling the IT support number directly in order to confirm the identity of the caller. And at this point here, we know for sure that this is, a legitimate activity, or if it's someone potentially trying to obtain information. From a IT support perspective, if an IT support individual receives a phone call from, let's say, someone posing as an employee of the organization, they should be asking specific questions in order to confirm the identity of the person calling. And those questions should be something like, employee number, address, something really specific to the employee that would not necessarily be known to a certain degree by someone calling and impersonating. And there should be multiple stages of that. And second, before any sort of password requests password resets are performed for any of those call-ins, there should be some sort of multi-factor authentication in place where the individual who's requesting to have their password reset receives some sort of authentication code on their device to confirm their identity. Okay, I think that's it, Courtney. So next we're going to talk about weak passwords. So weak passwords it encompasses pretty much all aspects of business, whether it be for online portals to individual passwords for computers, access to individual folders, etc. So we'll talk first about, I guess, defending the house or defending your home. And that has to do with making sure that you've changed default passwords on your devices at home. Anything from smart devices to your Wi-Fi access points, and not just the SSID password or the password that you would use to connect to your wireless, but also the administrative password to access the device and make any sort of changes to it. All of the default passwords should be changed. And in addition to that, all passwords, both at home and for business, should all be strong and they should all be unique. When we're talking about strong passwords, we're talking about passwords that are exceptional in length. Typically, we would recommend a minimum of 12 characters, but even in today's landscape, 12 characters is not necessarily enough, especially if it's a very common word or common phrase. What we like to recommend is using what's called a passphrase. A passphrase is going to be a bunch of small words put together that may not make sense in any sort of literal context, but it would be easy to remember. And ultimately, the longer the password, the more difficult it would be for an individual to either brute force the attack, or if, let's say by chance, an attacker did happen to capture a authentication hash from a user, if that password is really long, it's going to take a very, very long time for that attacker to be able to recover the clear text password from that hash. So ensuring that passwords for both business and personal accounts are strong and unique. And the reason why we want to have the separation between the business and the personal accounts is because individuals do have a tendency to have the same passwords for both personal and business related activities. And so if one device or one account is potentially compromised, an attacker could pivot to the business aspect or vice versa. Now, obviously, with all of these passwords, it becomes very difficult to remember what password you're utilizing for each service, especially if you're trying to remember passwords for both business and personal accounts. So what we typically recommend is what's called a password manager. And a password manager is a encrypted, protected piece of software that's either run by the organization or could be a software that's installed specifically on the individual machine. And it can be cloud-based. It could be completely off the cloud. It really depends on how you want to secure your environment. But ultimately, all you need to do is remember one password to be able to access a list of all of your passwords. And then at that point, you can just copy whatever password you need for a specific service in order to access it. And you can set in password managers expiries, rotations, and you can have really complicated passwords, including all sorts of special characters with really long passwords in length. Okay, Courtney. And finally, the last risk to be paying attention at home or working in a work from home environment is outdated systems. It's actually outdated systems and outdated software. So attackers are going to be looking for the path of least resistance, and typically that would be a social engineering type of event. But if they see that the hardware that an individual is using is potentially vulnerable to novel exploits, or if, let's say, there's a piece of software on that system that hasn't been patched in a while, an attacker can try and attack that specifically rather than going through a social engineering type of event. And so we need to ensure that procedures are followed regarding updating systems and software. typically you would have some sort of patch management service at an organization that would push these out automatically to organizational systems and make sure that the software and the operating system have been kept up to date. It's also good practice to consistently remind employees that if a device or software alerts the individual of updates that need to be performed, especially anything related to anti-malware or your endpoint security, that those individuals update those on a regular basis. And at some point, if it's not updated, it should be automatically pushed out by IT support. And finally, one thing to mention to employees is if they're not sure about what specific software needs to be updated, that they should be reaching out to their IT department to confirm, especially if they receive a prompt for something very innocuous that may not normally require an update. That could be an indication of a compromise as well. So you may want to have employees reach out to IT support and request or ask if that software is supposed to be updating if the employee is not sure. Okay, and so those are the 3 risks. We'll hand it back to Courtney because there are some additional considerations we need to take into account on working from
Thanks, Chris. So yeah, just some additional considerations to take into account when working from home. So these are some items that you can provide guidelines on to with your employees for. So firstly, Wi-Fi. So Chris touched on this a bit, but some other points is that you only want to allow people you trust to connect to your Wi-Fi. So consider making a guest Wi-Fi, even if there's not people necessarily visiting your home right now. You can always put your smart devices, your IoT devices on a separate guest network than your regular network. So that way it has a separation between any of your work-related devices and even personal devices. So in the event if one of your smart devices, like a smart home hub or anything like that, does get compromised, it won't affect anything that's on your regular network. Another consideration is to ensure you're using WPA2 or higher for authentication. So that's the protocol to use to make sure when you're authenticating to your wireless router that you're using that protocol. Most modern home routers have WPA2 as the default when you're setting up your SSIDs. So just make sure that you're advising employees and when you're setting them up yourselves not to click other options like WEP. WEP is it's available on devices just for legacy devices to be able to still connect, but it's not recommended for use anymore, and it's easily compromised. So WPA2 or higher is important to be used. Lastly, for Wi-Fi, don't leave any SSIDs open. So without a password, you want to make sure any SSID, even if it's a guest network, you want to put a password on all SSIDs at your house. Next point here, use a VPN whenever possible. So this just allows an additional layer of security and traffic to be encrypted back to your organization. There's a lot of other solutions that you can use as well, but VPNs are a common solution that we see in organizations. And lastly, ensure other people in the home don't have access to work-related devices. So even if it's a family member, you should try, like, as best as you should not have family members be using work-related devices. Even though they're trusted, they can easily click on something or download something that they're not supposed to, and then it could introduce some kind of malware into your work-related devices. So it's best just to not let anyone use corporate devices. Some additional guidelines that you can also provide to employees would be to not leave any hard copy information on any desks or anything within their houses. So if they're leaving their work area for the day, just make sure that hard copy information is stored somewhere like in a locked drawer, just so if it's confidential, nobody's reading it. Same with computer screens. If you're stepping away from your computer screen, even if it's within your house, just to prevent anybody else from using your computer, to just lock it. That way, you'll still need a password to get into it. And also ensure anti-malware is enabled on all your devices. So Chris already touched on that, making sure anti-malware is enabled and up to date. And it's also a good idea to provide your employees with additional security awareness training. So a lot of organizations typically do security awareness training throughout the year, but just because of the circumstances that we find ourselves in right now, it could be a good idea to give additional security awareness training on working from home, especially if your employees aren't used to it. And also add in some COVID-19 related topics. Like Chris mentioned earlier, there's targeted campaigns that appear to be coming from, governments with links to COVID information, things like that. So there's just campaigns out there right now that are emerging that employees may not be aware of. So it's best just to provide them with that information. Now we'll go to the question and answer period.
Awesome. Thanks, Courtney. Thanks, Chris. Just a reminder, you can enter your questions in the Q&A chat box. If you don't see that, click anywhere on WebEx and you'll see 3 dots at the bottom. Click there and then click Q&A and you can start entering that in. Also a reminder, if you don't know your CDW account manager, I've just thrown email address to contact and they can catch you accordingly. So we'll jump over to our first question. First question, and either Chris or Courtney just chime in to answer this. What is the recommended system for home use? Is this a laptop? Is this a personal computer, an iPad, a Chromebook, etc.?
Okay, so I'll jump in here, Courtney. So typically for home use, it really depends on whether or not you have a, work at home environment already set up, or for individuals who are new to working at home, it could vary between the two. So really, in terms of a security perspective, both a laptop and a computer need to have the same considerations. There's really no, recommended device, but a laptop does allow you to move around the house and potentially go into another room for a meeting if other people are in the house that could potentially be distracting or making loud noises. Whereas a PC, obviously, if you already have a PC set up, there's nothing wrong with that either. I would typically avoid using any sort of a tablet or mobile device as your main device for accessing work-related infrastructure, just because the support that you would have from IT typically wouldn't be the same as it would for a laptop or a PC, as well as there could be other security considerations that may be overlooked with tablet devices or mobile devices.
Awesome. On to the next question related to password managers. Is 1Password a reliable password generator if you're selecting 16 characters or above?
The tool 1Pass, is that what's
yeah? So 1Password, you can have it generate a password for you. You get to select how many characters. Do you view using a tool like 1Password and saying, "Hey, create me a password for a unique password for a login," and you saying, "Hey, above 16 characters," do you think that is a reliable and secure way to go about your passwords?
Yeah, typically that would be recommended. Obviously, you do want to have some sort of password rotation as well, whether that be every 30 to 60 days, just to ensure that if that account does potentially get compromised in any way, that it isn't compromised long term. But having a password randomized is definitely a good way to ensure that there's no possible way that any individual would be able to guess that password.
Yeah, and for 1Password, I know that they have, it's not just about the length. So I think with 1Password, you have the option to select if you want different characters, if you want uppercase, lowercase numbers. So all of that also comes into consideration. And I believe 1Password also gives you a rating. So if it says like very good, fantastic, excellent, something like that. So just ensuring that the password that you're selecting has the variable, like different characters, and also has a good rating with whatever tool you're using.
Awesome. I know I personally use 1Password, and it will actually even tell you if you have the same password for multiple logins, so you can go through and change it accordingly. Now we'll go on to our next question. Are personal devices the biggest risk to remote working?
So I'll answer that. So I wouldn't necessarily call them the biggest risk, but they are definitely a risk. And the reason for personal devices being a risk is we tend to be a little bit more lenient in terms of our security practices surrounding personal devices, whether that be a mobile phone or our own laptops. And if we are accessing, I guess, work-related infrastructure or work-related documents on any of these devices, definitely that's a huge risk. But when it comes to remote working, obviously you need to take both into consideration that, you need to be protecting both your personal devices as well as your work-related devices. I wouldn't necessarily call it the biggest risk, but it's definitely something to consider.
Awesome. So on to our next question. Can you use TeamViewer third-party remote software instead of a VPN?
So it's definitely a solution. It may not be necessarily the best solution, but TeamViewer software, I wouldn't say that it's completely secure. Obviously, there's going to be some vulnerabilities that do get released on a regular basis, and they do patch them. If you're not keeping up to date with your patching, obviously you could potentially be vulnerable. But because communications do go through team servers, public IPs, there always lies that risk of it not having a direct communication to your environment, to your organization. So while it is still secure in most senses, it's not going to be as secure as a direct connection to with a VPN client to your organization.
Okay, and I've seen a few of these questions pop up now. What is your recommendation for secure online video conferencing for home use? Do you have a preference of application, Zoom, WebEx, Teams? And I have another question kind of leads to this. Heard a lot about Zoom recently. Do you have any recommendations on collaboration software used securely?
Yeah. So prior to a few days ago, I would have definitely said Zoom, but going forward, I would definitely suggest looking at alternatives outside of Zoom. Obviously, with the recent news, there has been a lot of adoption for Zoom, and as a result, many vulnerabilities being exposed, which if you are still currently using Zoom, you need to ensure that you're consistently updating it, as they have been releasing regular updates almost daily now to address many of the vulnerabilities that have come across lately. In terms of other platforms, there are multiple other platforms that can be utilized. Obviously, Cisco WebEx is a pretty secure platform for the most part. Cisco does have a good track record of making sure that they keep their software and infrastructure up to date regularly with patches. So I would say Cisco WebEx is a pretty good alternative. Microsoft Teams is also a good tool. However, it's not necessarily too useful, I think, for external parties. I would recommend using something like Cisco or even GoToMeeting for external related conferencing.
Okay, our next question I can actually answer because it's about supply chain. Question is, how has CDW supply chain been affected from COVID-19 in relation to obtaining work equipment and lead times? So we're seeing extended lead times, mainly around laptops, desktops. Mice and keyboards are not too bad, but it's really the desktops, laptops, and monitors that we're seeing delays on. If you are after this equipment for yourself or your employees, by all means, connect with your CDW account manager. Let them know what you want. Many companies have specific models and makes that they need. or that they want to standardize, so we can kind of keep an eye out for when those things come in stock. One of the big benefits with CDW is because of our large global presence, we have fantastic relationships with a number of manufacturers and vendors around the world. And because of that, we can grab stock more often and quickly and get that delivered. With CDW, if you're IT purchasing and you want to buy stuff for your employees, we can also have that arranged mailed directly to that employee through your purchasing agreement. Again, reach out to your CDW account manager. We're happy to help on that. Back to some of the other questions we have here. Chris or Courtney, do you have a cybersecurity configuration tool that you would recommend?
So I guess the question is a little ambiguous because cybersecurity configuration tool, I'm not quite sure what that's referring to per se. Courtney, do you have any thoughts as to what that means?
It depends. I mean, if we're talking about configuring devices at home, we might be talking about like Active Directory solutions or something like that. It can push policies to home devices. So if you're using a directory service like Active Directory to administer your corporate laptops, I would say that's the best configuration tool to use because you can make sure that patches are being pushed out, that security policies are being taken into consideration, and all your computers have a minimum password length. All the antivirus is always enabled and it's up to date. So just any directory service, I would say in that sense. Other than that, I'm not sure about what specific configuration tools.
Yeah, I guess it would really depend on the environment as well. And there's going to be specific tools for different infrastructure. And for mobile devices, some sort of MDM device to manage mobile devices would definitely be something to consider as well. But I guess it's really specific to the organization and what it is that they're accomplishing.
So something that we're happy to have a conversation on, dive deeper to find that custom solution for that custom.
Exactly. Perfect.
Awesome. So on to our next question. Are there any minor or major risks when working in a Mac environment? What additional steps can we take to make the Mac environment more secure?
Yeah, so Mac environments, just like Windows, they do have risks associated with them. We do see a lot less exploitations out there for Mac environments, but they do still exist. Macs typically come with some kind of anti-malware already enabled, but there are LDAP directory solutions that can be used with a Mac environment as well. So to push out policies to all your corporate devices just to make sure that your security policies are being enforced. I don't know, Chris, did you want to talk to some of the risks you see for exploits for Macs?
Well, typically a risk you would see are going to be the same kind of risks you would see in a Windows environment, where individuals will try to elevate privileges on systems and then use that to try and pivot off into other areas of the network. So if you are using a directory service and individuals have access to shared folders, best practices for both a Windows environment and a Mac environment would really be to follow the principle of least privilege for those folders, so that individuals don't have access to information that they shouldn't be having access to. They should only be having access to areas or folders or files that they need to use on a regular basis and nothing more. So that if something does happen and it does if a system does get compromised, that the attacker can't start moving through the network from that compromised system. So I wouldn't say that there's any sort of major or minor risk when comparing a Mac to a Windows. Ultimately, they it does apply in both cases. We just don't typically see as much exploitation in Mac environments as you would see in Windows environments.
Awesome. Okay, on to our next question. What are the primary security concerns with smart home hubs? Should we refrain from using them, or can we safely use them without concern of being hacked?
So I think
Chris answer this one since Did
Uh,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, so thanks, Courtney. Yeah, so we actually did a CBC Marketplace documentary last year related to smart homes and specifically surrounding smart home hubs. So this is kind of a funny question, but um, so smart home hubs, and Courtney did touch on this previously. Um, they're going to be, I guess, your central point of access for all your smart devices in order to communicate out to the rest of them in the house. And typically, with smart home hubs, you'd want to have some sort of, you want to definitely change the default password if there's a default password associated with it. And you also want to make sure that if there is some sort of multi-factor authentication option, that you ensure that that's in place for basically all your smart home devices, but specifically the smart home hub. And the reason for that is if someone does manage to get access to your smart home hub, let's say they manage to get into your wireless network, and then they have managed to pivot onto the smart home hub, that smart home hub communicates with every other device. So that could effectively compromise every other device. And with smart home hubs and any smart home device, if there's a software or a software as a service or an online service related with the device in particular, you want to make sure that that online service is just as well protected as the device itself. So if there's a username and username and password requirement, the password is going to be complex because if someone's able to access the device, let's say remotely, they could then pivot into the network internally. So I wouldn't say we should refrain from using them by any means. I mean, smart home hubs are here to stay, in my opinion. It's a convenience. You just need to make sure that you're practicing good security hygiene when installing any sort of smart device in your house. So again, changing default passwords, making sure passwords are quite unique and have a good amount of characters, so 12 characters minimum, but I would suggest more. And then making sure that if they have an online service that you've enabled some sort of multi-factor authentication as well.
Awesome. Okay, a few more questions here. Next one is there a place in Canada where you can report cyber incidents / crime, and can you check the status on that?
Yeah, so I can take this one. There's a government website that you can report cybercrime to. So it's on cyber.gc.ca. They have links to support or report various cybercrimes. So there's like spam, cybercrime, fraud, threats to critical infrastructure, and then they have links to those specific areas where you can report them to. If we're talking about privacy breaches, if there's a breach of any personally identifiable information or personal health information, under privacy legislation, well, in Canada at least, and the United States also has lots of privacy legislation. So you just have to check your jurisdictions to know what the privacy reporting windows are. But in Canada, you have to report any privacy breaches to the Privacy Commissioner's office, and then as well check with the local provincial legislation. A lot of provinces have individual legislation on privacy breaches as well. So just know legislation in your jurisdictions for what your responsibilities are for reporting on incidents. As for statistics, government websites do have some statistics regarding cybercrime. So the website I spoke about before, the cyber.gc.ca, they have reports, tips, assessments, stuff like that. Stats Canada also has statistics from the previous census. It is a little old because the census hasn't been done since the 2017 census, but you can also look there for information. And many security firms also publish their own studies as well. So CDW does one every year, and we're going to be coming out with one in the coming months, I believe, for last year's data.
Awesome. Just a few more questions here, but we'll get on to the next one. With teams working remotely, do you have additional or different recommendations on how to prepare for an incident response in the event that there's an infection or other security event with everybody working?
So I guess in terms of how to prepare, if it's not already in place, some sort of response, email, as Courtney mentioned previously in the presentation, ensuring that there's that open communication channel where individuals can report potential security incidents or concerns that they may have with something going on their device. But in terms of an outbreak, because individuals will typically be on their own networks, it to really, I guess, pinpoint where an infection starts and how it spreads through the network, that's going to be a little bit more difficult because obviously, unless you have the proper detections in place already on the endpoints, and that those are reporting consistently back to individuals who are monitoring this with some sort of SIM or SOC who's taking care of this, then it will be hard if you don't have that in place already. And Phil, we can talk maybe if someone had some specific questions about how to best design something like this. Maybe that's something we can talk about with the appropriate AE.
Yeah, and the security team and risk advisory as well. We work with clients all the time to implement security incident response plans and conduct exercises to make sure that everyone's aware of their responsibilities. So it's definitely something that we can talk to individual clients about.
Awesome. So reach out to your CDW account manager and let's have that discussion. On to one of the last few questions here because we are coming up on the hour. How do we know if we have enough security?
So that's a very
bit general.
It's a very general question, and I don't really think there's ever some sort of quantitative measure of how much security you can have. I mean, reality is the landscape is changing every single day, and things that weren't necessarily a concern previously are now becoming concerns, and you need to have multiple layers of security to ensure that you're protecting your organization. The motto "defense in depth" is typically how I would like to recommend organizations approach security. So in terms of how to determine whether or not you have enough, I mean, that's, again, a conversation for every organization. It really depends on what it is you're trying to secure and how you're trying to secure it. So another question that I would recommend individuals reach out to CWAE to discuss further.
Awesome. And next question here. Measuring workforce productivity in a work from home environment.
Yeah, so Chris and I are, that's not our expertise per se, but we have seen some solutions that clients use to monitor productivity. It really depends what your company culture is, and if you want to be implementing things like that on your corporate devices, because there are privacy concerns with monitoring tools like that. I don't know, Chris, did you want to touch on that as well? Or?
Yeah, it's definitely something that needs a further discussion. It's not something that can just be implemented right away. Obviously, with monitoring tools installed on devices, that is kind of breaching privacy in it. So that really has to be an organizational level discussion and then passed down to employees so that generally they should be aware that this is on there. The other concern is sometimes these tools don't necessarily reflect accurately what an individual is potentially doing. Just because you have a monitoring tool installed on a laptop, for instance, doesn't mean that that individual has not been spending the last 6 hours on calls making sales. So to measure, I guess, productivity on just with one a tool like that is not the greatest. I'd say something really, I guess the easiest way to do this is having some sort of time card um, implementation where individuals can go in and report what they did for the day. And obviously there's going to be a certain level of trust with your employees surrounding them entering appropriate or the truthful hours of what they did during the day. So again, Courtney and I are not experts when it comes to this. This is just kind of our own personal experiences with certain things. And I would recommend, if you're looking for a specific solution, again, you reach out to your CDW.
Awesome. And we will just do one last question and then we'll sign off for the day. What is the best practice for remote password changes?
So for remote password changes, the best practice would be that an individual has to get in touch typically with someone from IT support, and then you do have some sort of multi-factor authentication mechanism in place so that IT support can validate whether or not the individual who's calling in to reset their password, or if it's a web portal, for instance, that individuals can access, that they have some means of identifying that the individual trying to reset the password is who they are, who they say they are. And then at that point, it should be pretty straightforward after that. So that's what I would recommend for the best practice, that there is some sort of multi-factor authentication in place, but that there is some sort of either IT portal that employees can access themselves, or a support number that they can contact to push this out. And again, this is really dependent on your environment. If you don't have multi-factor authentication in place, something you may want to consider putting in, as well as ensuring that your Active Directory structure, if that's what you're using, that individuals are properly connected to the domain, so that when you do push these out, that they can receive these updates. And typically for something like that, you may even need to have a VPN connected in order to do so. But again, it's really dependent on the infrastructure and the organization itself.
Awesome. Thank you guys for answering all those questions. We will end the session there. I wanted to thank everybody for joining. As a reminder, if you're unsure of who your CDW account manager is, please email marketingteam@cdw.ca. That email address is in the chat. I'd like to thank Chris and Courtney today for their time in running us through this and answering all these questions. And have a great afternoon.
Yeah. Thank you, Phil. Thanks, everybody, for joining in.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.